Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Hudson Lee, Light Dancer. Alright, it's time once again to talk about Hudson Lee, co-founder of the indie label Upscale. Well, I suppose lately Upscale's been operating more like a loose artist collective than a traditional label. I feel like they've been doing a lot more just promoting for artists who are otherwise self-releasing, such as Alexander Panos and Thorian and Park and whatnot, than they are actually releasing stuff under their own umbrella lately. But whatever, Hudson Lee is the one doing a lot of said promoting and is the one who brought the recent work from those other artists to my attention. Now, this will be my third time covering Hudson Lee in a solo review. Links to my videos on his previous two albums can be found in the description, but for those uninitiated to his work, way back in 2019, this guy really impressed me when he put out his debut album, Headspaces. Combining elements of glitch hop and neuro IDM and dubstep with a kind of low-key singer-songwriter-y style that really set himself apart from the scene at the time, while also doing a lot to bring artists on that scene together through all the various guest features, both in terms of vocalists like Laura Bram, Evoke, and especially Lassa Patique, who featured on almost half the track listing, but also rising underground star co-producers such as Vorso, False Noise, and fellow Upscale co-founder Frequent to make it feel even more like a big event. It may not have hit me on first listen, but by the end of that year, it had grown on me to end up getting marked as my number 2 favorite album of that entire year, as well as notching a spot on my and Landon Remix's list of one of the best albums of the entire 2010s decade. It felt like we were getting a look at a possible path for a bright new future in electronic music. Whether or not that future actually came to pass is arguable. I feel like the pandemic might have thrown some things off, and since then, big, ambitious projects of that style became marginally harder to come by. But, you know, that's what it felt like in 2019. Now, following up an album like this was going to be one hell of a task. The likelihood that he'd be able to fully recapture everything that made Headspaces special a second time while also making sure it could stand on its own was extremely slim at best. So he opted to not even try to go for the same ambitious scale on his sophomore album Reflex Angle in 2021. I will admit that I've barely come back to that album at all since it came out, and it's even slightly shrunk on me since I reviewed it, but I think it was a smart move to make in the long run. Feeling like an intentional downscaling of his sound, trying to focus specifically on what he could bring to the table as a producer on his own without relying so heavily on guest features, and thereby reset people's expectations of what a Hudson Lee album could be in a way that wouldn't put as much pressure on himself. And to be clear, even if Reflex Angle is obviously no Headspaces, the album is still very solid. It's not like Hudson Lee didn't already have a particular recognizable sound that could work well on its own merits, and in leaning into that, he did still deliver plenty of strong moments. Especially that album's opener, Axon, sticks out as a particular standout. So, it's been 3 years since that album came out. When I found out he'd be releasing a third album upon his sending me an advance copy about a month before the album dropped, I was definitely excited to hear what he might be delivering this time around. This latest album was apparently inspired by his having moved to the Pacific Northwest and getting more in touch with his Chinese heritage. He recorded a lot of different sounds on hikes. And he'd also been inspired to start incorporating his own vocals in his music for the first time after he finally got surgery to resolve some longer-term respiratory illnesses he'd been suffering from. I could have sworn he sang a little bit on certain moments on Headspaces, but if he did, it was more backup singing then. Here he actually takes the lead vocals on multiple tracks. Now, the resulting album isn't exactly a radical shift in sound away from what you'd already expect out of a new Hudson Lee album. I guess it's got a slightly more organic and melody-centric edge to it on average without as many big heavy bangers, but other than that, this still very much sounds like the same guy who made Headspaces, and if you liked any of his previous work, you'll have no trouble getting into this as well. But I have obviously taken my time actually getting around to this one and letting it sit with me, and I gotta say, yeah, this was in fact great. Like Reflex Angle, this isn't an album trying anything super ambitious or out of the box by his standards. It's trying to keep things really tight and straight to the point at a concise 41 minutes. But where his last album could almost feel like he was holding back from his true potential, this one feels more like he just sat down and actively focused on the best ideas he could deliver in the moment. and as similar it is in approach to his previous work, none of it ever feels like it's actively rehashing ideas he's done before. It feels more like he's reconstructing some similar ideas from the ground up out of new sounds in a way that makes it obvious how he's felt more creatively recharged. And all of that results in an album that I found far more easily replayable than his last one, and more immediate too, maybe even more immediate than Headspace's, which did need several months to properly grow on me initially. This one hit on first listen, and I got the exact same amount of enjoyment every subsequent time I put it on. Now, unlike Headspace's, it's not a listen that kept revealing lots of new sides to it the longer I spent with it. I still think that album is better, but this wasn't a listen that ever got old either, no matter how many times I put it on. I think it might also be his most seamless album experience yet as well. The transitions between every track are so smooth, and each track feels like such a logical continuation of the track that came before, where this whole album almost borders on feeling like a single 41-minute track. But that's obviously not to say the album ever runs together too much either. There's a decent amount of variety to consistently keep things fresh. The album intro, Sprout, almost starts out sounding like some kind of off-kilter folk tune with unsteady pianos, upright bass, and very light electric guitar soloing before the synths start to come in and envelop the mix, and the whole second half of the track almost sounds like it's transitioned into a new track entirely, as it seems to focus on some processed and manipulated humming vocal textures presented as ambient pads before the instrumentation from the first half returns to join it. Pretty cool intro. But the point at which the album really feels like it starts to get going is Orchid Sprite with Sebastian Vidra. That's definitely one of the catchiest and most easily memorable ideas on the album, and that core vocal chop that runs through many parts makes for a very solid hook. While all the various warm and bright melodic textures that wrap around everything alongside more guitars and pianos and even some flutes and woodwinds that show some of that Chinese influence coming in really elevate the track for me. There's also a nice big cello solo and neat ambient side tracks with all sorts of odd percussion textures. A track like this definitely sets the tone for the kind of sound you can expect out of the album as a whole, and most of the other tracks here will have similar instrumentation and a similar feel. So from there we move into Twine Tether, which is probably the track on the album that grew on me the most over time. The more delicate bell melodies going over the more complex stop-start percussion mixes didn't strike me as a standout at first, but became catchier the more times I put the album on. And there's some cool punchier and more live-sounding drums that come in at some points, which I like, and a whole little drop section with lots of shuffling percussion and chaotic, barely melodic violin performances, which was fun. And that transitions directly into Weathervein, which is the first track to prominently feature Hudson's own vocals. Turns out he's pretty serviceable taking a lead vocal performance. His voice sounds pretty similar to his colleague Alexander Panos or the other male guest vocalists he brought on for Headspace's, thus making for a very natural fit for these instrumentals, and he sounds perfectly at home. He can maybe mumble a bit, I can't make out all the lyrics, but not like the lyrics really matter that much in the context of a project like this. The actual tune behind this track is another one of the catchiest in the bunch too. The melody, that whole section where he kind of harmonizes with himself, was just continually looping through my head for most of last night. Now from here we do move into a stretch of 3 tracks, which is the point at which the album is most likely to fall into the background for me. It's probably the album's weakest spot. The sort of dramatic ambience of Bedlocked and the borderline lo-fi hip-hop of Chase the Sun are quick interludes that maintain the pacing but don't really deliver super striking ideas in their own right, and the track in between them, called Wibble, while feeling more substantive than those interludes, still feels like a bit of an indistinct meander through a whole bunch of disconnected sounds and ideas without a hook or even a groove to really tie them together. Again, all good tracks on their own, and they all keep up the same vibes as the rest of the album without feeling out of place. They make the experience feel all the more seamless, but there have been many listens I've given this album where those 3 tracks just pass me by altogether without me even noticing they happened at all. However, that won't really be a problem again for any of the tracks after that. Earthly Angel always stuck out as a particular highlight. The Asian heart melodies that the track starts out on were much more attention-grabbing and easier to recognize than many of the ideas on the tracks leading up to it. It kind of builds into this upbeat and heartfelt glitch-hop waltz, and also features probably Hudson's most emotive vocal performance on the album. That's definitely one of the best tracks here. As is following cut Celestial Egg, a collab with none other than Koan Sound, a crossover which which feels so obvious I'm almost kind of surprised it hasn't happened before. It definitely sounds like what you'd expect a collab between these artists would sound like. Maybe not as intense or cinematic as the kind of thing that would show up on, say, Led by Ancient Light, but kind of sticking to the chill but upbeat, well-textured glitch hop sound that they've had in common. You'll get a lot of very pretty and well-layered mixes of strings and melodic bell textures with a few processed vocal chops that make for another pretty striking hook that ensure this track never falls in the background for me. Also, there's kind of a more energetic and dramatic change up near the end where the tempo briefly speeds up that I thought was cool and really added to the track as well. And then we get the album's longest track, Curve This, featuring both Frequent and Alexander Panos. This track may not have among the strongest of hooks on the album outside of maybe that upright bass riff at the beginning, but it definitely feels like something of a centerpiece moment for the album that packs in the most glitches and details to fully justify that length. Not that 5.5 minutes is really that long, but they do pack a lot in that time. There's some electric piano textures on this one that almost make it sound like Tipper got involved, as well as some of the biggest and heaviest bass drops the album has to offer. And I think Panos might have sung on that whole Fly Again part near the end. That was a nice catchier moment for the album too. The track does end in a fade out, but I almost didn't even notice that was the case since the following cuts just pick up right from where I left off. Full Moon has a lot of jumpy and bright plucked melodies that keep abruptly stopping and starting up again in a cool way, just like building anticipation with those brief, less than half a second silences. And they do pay off into some other warmer and fuller sounding sections in a loose verse-chorus sort of structure. The title track has something of a similar idea but makes it more energetic and upbeat, gives it a new equally catchy hook, and adds in all these kinda charmingly awkward baby voiced vocal chops with more squeaky violin solos and a whole section around the halfway mark where Hudson just like stutter edits his own voice into oblivion, which was a pretty awesome moment. Both of those tracks make for particular highlights, and then that finally takes us to the closer Sunflower in collaboration with Voljum, another crossover which makes all the sense in the world. There's not really a hook to this track, nor does it really have much of a structure to adhere itself to, but it makes up for that by feeling like the perfect emotional note fit for an album like this to close out, as it rapidly evolves through sections of densely layered plucked strings and bells and guitars, cinematic movie soundtrack strings and pianos that have kind of much more sentimental, almost Gershwin-y tone to their melodies and chord progressions, and other moments where any of these instruments get solo time or just pluck away together ad nauseum, before just kind of slowing down and stopping, almost a little abruptly, but still feeling perfectly satisfying. And if you bought the album on Bandcamp, there's also a bonus track called Lantern after that, which kind of has a marginally rougher and grittier rock-influenced flavor to the same kinds of sounds seen elsewhere on this album. It's also very solid and would have fit perfectly well had it been included in the standard track listing, although I didn't include it when I put it on my iPod for personal listen, since Sunflower was so obviously designed to be the album closer, and adding this on the end kind of takes away from that track's feeling of more closed-up finality, especially considering this track ends way more abruptly with like an out-of-nowhere hard cut, as if it'd been designed to transition into something else, like it was meant to go somewhere else in the middle of the album, but he decided to leave it off for pacing reasons or something. I don't know. But yeah, that's everything on Light Dancer. Can't really complain too much about anything here. It's a really freaking nice listen. Got all the same level of high detail sound design and emotional depth that I'd want out of a new Hudson Lee album, and it's probably the most singularly cohesive work he's put out yet. I may still personally prefer the more ambitious scale of Headspaces, but I can see why Hudson might be even more content with the work he did here, as it does feel even more personal to him than the already quite personal stuff he did before. There's a level of greater intimacy, and all of it feels fresh and creatively energized, despite the fact that it's not really that far a cry from other stuff he's done before. I think there's a possible case to be made for other people considering this his strongest work yet, and it might even make for an easier starting point to get into Hudson Lee for those who haven't heard anything he's done previously. Not much else to say. This album was great. I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up showing up on my year-end list somewhere, and if you've missed it, I definitely recommend giving it a shot. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.